Welcome to this session on identifying market segments and selecting target markets, which is basically about segmentation. So let's see. The idea about segmentation, well, that is basically to divide the whole market into smaller groups or segments, so to say, of potential customers. So imagine that we have a situation where we would like to sell a product and we have the whole Danish market or the whole German market. So we would like to be able to address our customers in the best possible way, and therefore it makes sense to divide that whole market into smaller groups or segments that could be divided by males, females, for example, or by age groups. But let's see. Well, we are going to divide that market in order to address specific segments, and therefore having those segments, we will be able to address those segments with the best possible marketing mix. And that's the idea about making segmentation, that we can end up choosing segments where we can address, here as you can see, a marketing mix A to segment 1 and a marketing mix to segment 2. Now we want to target a specific part or a specific segment of the market, and this chosen segment become our target group, or if we choose more, we actually have those chosen segments become our target groups. And therefore, have we more than one, as you can see here, we have the red marketing mix addressing the target group 1, and we may have another marketing mix B addressing target group number 2. So let's go back and take a look at it once more. So to divide the market into smaller groups and segments of potential customers, we'll take a stand in a lawn mower as the one that you can see right here. So how do we identify the best target group in this particular case? Well, we simply need to identify some criteria that we can use in order to segment this particular market. So first of all, we need to take a little discussion. Are we looking at the business to consumer market, or do we look at the business to business market? Because there will be a difference in the different kinds of criteria that we can use in these two markets. But in this case, let us take a look at the consumer market. That means that we are taking a stand in the business to consumer. So what criteria can be used in this case? Well, can we, for example, use the age? Imagine we have a lawn mower. We have that lawn mower here. Can we use age, means how old are people? Can we use that to differentiate between groups in the market to figure out who will actually be the most potential customer for this particular lawn mower here? For example, does it make sense that we would point at an age group from 10 to 15 and say they are the most possible ones buying this product? Well, probably not. So we have to figure out maybe age could be 20 to 60 or some other age group. What about income? Does that mean anything to us? Whether the potential market would be interesting and attractive, that we could use income? Should people earn more than a specific amount of money in order to be able to buy the product? What about the area of urban areas or rural areas? Is that something that we would make sense of in using for differentiating between the different groups in the marketplace? So these were just 3 different kinds. There are lots of different criteria. So what do we choose? Well, we would choose criteria that is actually helping us and leading us to segments with a need for a lawn mower. That will be one of the basic issues here, that we would like to choose criteria that we can use in dividing the market into segments that actually need the product, in this case the lawn mower. So we choose criteria leading to these segments because if people in the segment are more or less alike, then there's a great chance that they actually have the same need for our product, and we can probably communicate with them in the same way. So if they have the same need and we can communicate with them in the same way, it means we do not have to have different kinds of communication, but we can simply use the same communication in our marketing mix, and we may have the ability to distribute to the same retailers in order to sell our product, and lots of other benefits. So therefore the marketing mix here is actually leading us and helping us to sell the product, and is addressing the target group that we can see right here. And that idea, as you can see here, is the part of the STP concept, means that we are segmenting, targeting and positioning in the marketplace. We are segmenting the market using criteria, we are targeting specific groups of that market, and we are trying to position ourselves in that particular market. The positioning part, though, is not part of this session. So with this basic understanding of segmentation, we'll now take a closer look at 4 different issues. First, we'll take a look at the segmentation process. Then we'll deal with the criteria for segmentation. We'll try to take a closer look at the attractiveness and how we evaluate segments, and a short look into how customers are creating, or what kind of preferences they might have. So let's continue. The segmentation process. So all processes of segmenting the market should start by understanding your own product service and the needs it satisfies with the customers. Because if you do not know your own product, and if you do not have an idea about the needs that your product is actually fulfilling with your customers, it can be quite difficult to figure out how to segment the market. So having understood your product or your service, you need to identify the different kind of criteria that can be used in order to segment the market. Means, if we look back, we remember that we talked about age, for example, we talked about income. Can these be used in order to divide the whole market into smaller parts? That would, in the end, lead to target groups that are willing and able to buy our lawn mower. How do we figure that out? Well, we can use surveys, and we can make analysis of that result that we get from our surveys in order to figure out what are the most important criteria. Is it age? Is it income? Well, we could ask customers in questionnaires, we could make focus group interviews, depth interviews. There are lots of different ways to investigate this, and in doing that we can also be more sure that what we are doing is actually correct. For this case, we might just make some assumptions about what criteria we can actually use. Then, having identified the criteria, we have to develop the profiles of the segment based upon the criteria that are used for segmentation. Now, this profile, let's give a little example here. It could be males between 30 and 60 years, living in rural areas, with a lawn, and an income above 100,000 euro. As you can see, this profile is actually based upon the criteria that we identified here in the first step. And we use here, you can see the criteria income, males, and rural area, urban area. And also the fact that people have a lawn, which is quite obvious in this case. So, having developed these profiles, we should probably go in and make an evaluation of the attractiveness of this market segment. And actually, we will make this evaluation for each identified market segment that we have. So how do we identify, or how do we make this evaluation of the attractiveness? Well, for most companies, more or less all companies, attractiveness is a matter of return on investment, ROI, and their long-run objectives. And then how do we then calculate that? How do we put numbers on economy, the return on investment? Well, we would make that evaluation based upon 5 different issues here, and we'll get back to these issues later when we discuss those specific phases here. But they have to be measurable, substantial, accessible, differentiable, and actionable. And if a segment is actually measurable, substantial, accessible, differentiable from the other in the market, and actionable, then it might be attractive. And then we will have to make a further analysis on the return on investment. Now, after the attractiveness, we have to choose target groups, because we may have found several segments, but we may not be able to address all of these segments, and therefore we have to choose which target groups are we going to address. So we choose one or more segments based upon the attractiveness that we found up here, and based on the company vision and the resources that the company have. So that was the process, and we'll now turn to have a look at the specific criteria that will be used for segmentation. That means those criteria that we use up here in the first step in order to figure out how can we divide the whole market into smaller parts. So, criteria for segmentation. Criteria for segmentation is also called the basis of segmentation. And these are the criteria, or some call them variables, that discriminate one segment from another. So different markets use different kinds of criteria. In this session we will look at the B2B, means the business to business market, and the B2C, means the business to consumer market. And first we will take a look at the business to business market. So what are those criteria that we can use in order to divide the whole market into smaller segments? Well, we have 5 overall criteria, and those are demographic, operating variables, purchasing approaches, situational factors, and personal characteristics. Let us take those one by one. First, we have the demographic factors. For example, industry, company size, and location. So we could divide the whole market based upon what kind of industry does these companies find themselves in, and what kind of product do we have. If we are selling lawn movers, are there any specific companies that would like to buy that? Any specific industry that might need that? What about the company size? Do they have any specific reason to buy a lawn mower if they have a specific size, for example? What about location? Where do they find themselves? Does location have an influence on the need for companies to be willing to buy a lawn mower? So these are the kind of questions we need to ask ourselves, and simply go through these segmentation criteria. And then we have to find those criteria that will actually help us in the best way to divide the whole market into smaller parts, and of course eventually figure out the target groups. Now let's proceed with the operating variables. We here have technology. Are the company a user or non-user? What about the customer's capabilities? We have purchasing approaches. What about the purchasing organization? What about the structure of power, the nature of existing relationships, general purchase policies, purchasing criteria? And then we have the situational factors, which are urgency, specific application, size of order. And the last one, personal characteristics. What about the buyer-seller similarity and attitudes towards risk? And the last one, loyalty. So all of these criteria As you can see, industry, company size, location, technology, user or non-user status, all of these can on an individual basis be used to segment the market for a lawn mower regarding the business-to-business market. So one example, it could be that the European industry of lawn mower producers with more than 1,000 employees and using electricity to power the lawn mowers. That could be one example of a segment, and it could be also an example of a target group in the end. And now let's move on to look at the criteria that we use at the consumer market. Here at the business to consumer market, the segmentation criteria are divided into 4 overall criteria. And just like before, we have more criteria hidden under each one. First, geographic. Here we have region. Are we in a city, or are we in a metro, or where are we? Or urban, suburban, rural, climate. And then we have demographic. You'll probably notice that you know some of these criteria. Age, generation, what kind of family size do we have, family life cycle, gender, income, education, occupation, religion, nationality, race, social class, etc. So demographic criteria describe the consumers here that we are looking at, whereas the psychographic criteria like lifestyle and personality more tell us something about how they live, for example. And behavioral, also about occasions, benefits, user status, rate, loyalty stage, readiness stage to buy, and the attitude towards the product. So again, these different criteria here help us to divide the whole market into smaller parts. And now let's try to take a closer look at the attractiveness, or how do we evaluate the segments. So attractiveness, evaluation of segments. In order to evaluate segments, we have those 5 boxes here that we can take a closer look at. You know these from before when we saw the first process of segmentation. We have measurable, substantial, accessible, differentiable, and actionable. Let's take these one at a time. Now, in order to evaluate a segment, we would have to be able to measure something. We would have to be able to measure the size of the segment. How large is it? Does it consist of 50,000 potential consumers? Maybe 1 million potential consumers? So there's a great difference in addressing a segment of different sizes. And then again, growth. What is the growth of the segment? Is it growing? Is it not growing? And what about their purchasing power? Do they actually have money? And what characterizes that particular segment? And again, we need to remember that this has to be done for each segment that we are finding in our segmentation process, and where we think they are probably very good segments. Then we have to evaluate that attractiveness. Okay, so substantial. One thing is that we can measure the size, the growth, the purchasing power, and the characteristics of those segments. But those segments also have to be substantial, means that they are actually large and profitable enough for us to serve them. So if they aren't large enough, then it doesn't make sense to go for them. And if they aren't profitable, it doesn't make sense to go for them. So already here we would be able to maybe rule out some of those segments because they aren't large enough, they aren't profitable. And accessible. One thing is that we can actually measure that it's a good segment, it has a substantial size, it is profitable. But what if we can't reach that particular segment? If we can't really get in contact with it and thereby serve that particular segment with our marketing mix, then it doesn't make sense to waste our resources on that particular segment, and we should actually just take it away. And if we have a substantial segment and we can actually assess it and we can get in contact with it, then we also need to figure out these segments. Are they different, and do they respond different to different marketing mix elements and programs? Simply means, can we go in and use, or should we use, different kinds of marketing mix in order to address different kinds of target groups? And actionable, are we able to formulate effective marketing mixes that can actually be attracting to the segment? So these are the 5 different areas that we need to investigate in order to evaluate the attractiveness of those segments. Can we find numbers? Are the segments substantial in size, and are they profitable? Can we effectively reach and serve those segments? Do we need to differentiate our marketing mixes, or can we use just one for one target group? And can we actually formulate a marketing mix that will make sense, and using that marketing mix we can foresee that our customers will buy our products? So let us look now at the preferences of customers. So what do customers prefer, and what do they value? Well, here we need probably help from the analysis of customer behavior, and that can help us to understand what customers prefer and what they value in a specific product and service. So consumers might value the factors A and B, where retailers for the same kind of product might value the factors M and D. So we cannot really say that it's only one factor that all in the marketplace is valuing, because different groups might value different factors. So we'll look at 3 different but overall situations. We have here what we call homogeneous preferences. This is a situation where we have 2 factors, X and Y. And these factors are quite describing the target group. Means that the market here is actually having the same type of preferences. Means that factor X is more or less here. This is where all the group is addressing factor X. They prefer the factor X to be at this level. They also prefer factor Y to be at this level. So therefore we call it quite homogeneous preferences, because everybody have more or less the same kind of preferences. So let's see what happens now. Well, we could also have this kind of scattered program here, or these dots representing lots of different customers. And as you can see, they have quite different ideas about what do they want from factor X. Could be price, for example, or quality, assortment, whatever. And therefore they're quite scattered around these factors, and also on the factor Y. Therefore we call it a diffuse preferences. And it can be quite difficult to make a good segmentation and end up choosing a segment here that will be our target group that can actually make a profit to us, because it can be difficult to find and hit everybody in the marketplace when they have so diffused preferences for the different factors, for price, quality, etc. And the last one we will look at here is what we call the clustered preferences. So as you can see, instead of having just one way of preferring factor X and Y, it could be price and quality, and instead of having them spread all over on price, some would have it very low, some would have it high, and high price and high quality, then these guys here, they are kind of collected in small clusters. So instead of having just one or spread all over, we have different groups. In this case, 3 different groups where people are having the same kind of preferences. So as we can see, this circle here, this group of people, they have quite different preferences compared to that group over here. And therefore we call it clustered preferences. And here we might actually use differentiated marketing mix. One marketing mix for this group, one for this, and maybe one for this. And maybe we will find that some competitors are trying to serve this customer group. Nobody is trying to serve this one. So we might actually be the only one trying to hit on that particular target group. So that's actually what segmentation is about. It's about understanding the preferences of the market. It's dividing the market into smaller parts. It's about understanding the profiles of those companies, those customers that we have. And therefore this helps us to understand if we are going to use more than one single marketing mix in the end. And that ends this session on segmentation.